Could a hypothetical Super Saiyan Bardock actually defeat Frieza? That's the main question here, but with a twist. Instead of focusing on just one version of Bardock, we'll be examining multiple iterations of the character to see whether the outcome changes depending on the continuity. Specifically, we'll be covering Bardock from the original 1990 DBZ special and the version of the 2011 episode of Bardock era. And finally, the modern incarnation seen in Dragon Ball Super and the manga. Starting with the Bardock from the 1990 TV special, this is the very first introduction audience ever had to Goku's father. In this version, Bardock is portrayed as a low-class Saiyan warrior who commands his own squad and regularly takes on difficult missions across the galaxy. Because of the dangerous nature of these battles, Bardock constantly returns from combat severely injured, only to recover and grow stronger afterward. This ties directly into one of the Saiyan's most broken biological traits, the Zenkai boost, the ability to drastically increase in power after recovering from near-death experiences. We see this mechanic repeatedly throughout Dragon Ball, with one of the best examples being Goku during the Namek Saga. After recovering in a healing chamber, Goku's power level skyrockets from around 90,000 to roughly 3 million. Saiyans become dramatically stronger after surviving brutal injuries, and Bardock's lifestyle naturally allowed him to exploit this trait over and over again. What also holds the Saiyan race back, ironically, is their own mindset. Saiyan society heavily believed that your status and potential were determined at birth. Most Saiyans didn't truly value discipline training or self-improvement. Even Vegeta himself originally dismissed the idea of training seriously until meeting Goku, a low-class Saiyan who spent his entire life studying under martial arts mastery, refining techniques, and continuously pushing beyond his limits. That philosophy eventually allowed Goku to overpower Vegeta during their first beam struggle despite Vegeta's elite status. As for Bardock specifically, his exact power level when first introduced is unknown. However, he's shown casually wiping out the inhabitants of planet Kanasa while in his grade 8 form alongside his squad. After the mission, Bardock is struck in his neck by one of the surviving Kanasans and knocked unconscious. Interestingly, when Bardock is later examined by the medical staff, they reveal that he has no real physical injuries at all. The only damage he suffered was mental. Of course, that mental injury is actually the result of Bardock gaining his ability to see visions of the future, which causes his brain waves to fluctuate abnormally. Before Bardock fully awakens and recovers, the doctor monitoring him makes a very important statement. Bardock's power level is approaching 10,000 and he may eventually even surpass King Vegeta himself. That's a significant claim because King Vegeta is portrayed as an incredibly powerful Saiyan in the anime continuity. In one anime-only scene, King Vegeta casually waves his hand and destroys multiple planets simultaneously. Depending on how someone interprets the feat, it can be scaled anywhere from large planetary to small star level in raw destructive capability. So the fact that Bardock was supposedly approaching that level of power says a lot about how strong he had become throughout constant combat and recovery. To keep things reasonable though, especially since Bardock is eventually going to be compared against Frieza and his forces, it's fairly simple to place him around a power level of 10,000 during his point in the special. That really isn't much of a stretch anyway, considering the doctor outright implied Bardock was already nearing that threshold. After recovering, Bardock travels to the planet where members of his squad had been sent earlier. There he discovers the aftermath of Frieza's betrayal. Nearly everyone is dead, and with only Tora barely surviving long enough to reveal the truth, Frieza intentionally set them up and ordered their extermination. Enraged by what happened, Bardock immediately attacks Dodoria's men and tears through the squad with little effort. However, the moment Dodoria himself actually enters the fight, the gap in power becomes obvious. Bardock is completely overwhelmed and Dodoria eventually blasts him at point-blank range with a mouth attack. Despite the severity of the attack though, Bardock somehow survives the encounter, although heavily injured. Keep in mind that Dodoria had a power level of around 22,000, while Bardock in the original continuity was only approaching 10,000. That would make Dodoria more than twice as strong as Bardock, yet Bardock still managed to survive a direct point-blank blast from him. Even after suffering that kind of damage, Bardock was still able to return to planet Vegeta and fight his way through large portions of Frieza's forces before Frieza himself finally stepped in to confront him. And that's where the first version of this scenario really comes to its conclusion. Now, if we apply the standard Super Saiyan multiplier of 50 times to Bardock's estimated 10,000 power level, that would place him at roughly 500,000 in strength. The problem is that this still falls slightly short of Frieza's first form, which sits at 530,000 at full power. So even with Super Saiyan, Bardock would technically still be fighting an opponent who was somewhat stronger than him before Frieza even begins transforming further. Because of that, Bardock's chances in this version of the matchup are extremely limited. The only realistic path to victory will be if he transformed immediately and went straight for a killing blow before Frieza had the opportunity to power up or transform into his later forms. Once Frieza reaches his second form, which exceeded 1 million in power, the fight becomes completely unwinnable for Bardock. So overall, in the case of the 1990 movie version, Frieza would still win the vast majority of the encounters, with only a small number of scenarios leading to Bardock pulling off an upset. Moving to the 2011 version of Bardock, things become far more complicated. The story itself is already somewhat strange because it acts like a continuation of the original Bardock special while simultaneously changing Bardock's fate entirely. Instead of dying to Frieza supernova, Bardock is mysteriously sent back in time and awakens on Planet Plant, the original world that would later become Planet Vegeta after the Saiyans conquered it. What's important here is Bardock's condition when he arrives. During his final confrontation with Frieza, Bardock had already been severely injured after surviving Dodoria's attack, but after being transported into the past, he's cared for and healed by the inhabitants of Planet Plant. And in Dragon Ball, recovering from near-death injuries grant Saiyans a Zenkai boost, dramatically increasing their power. The issue is that the story never tells us exactly how large this boost was. Bardock's power could have risen to 15,000, 20,000, or potentially even higher. On top of that, Bardock spends several days recovering, eating, and training while living among the inhabitants of Planet Plant, which would likely push his strength even further beyond where it originally was. Eventually, soldiers invade the planet and Bardock effortlessly overwhelms them, completely speed blitzing and defeating them without difficulty. Shortly afterward, he encounters Lord Chilled, an ancestor of Frieza. Bardock immediately attacks him out of anger, but at first he's completely dominated and beat down. As Bardock lies defeat, he begins remembering his fallen comrades who were murdered by Frieza and his forces. Because Chilled strongly resembled Frieza, Bardock channeled all of his hatred, grief, and rage towards him. That emotional explosion finally caused Bardock to awaken the Super Saiyan transformation. Once Bardock becomes a Super Saiyan, the entire fight changes instantly. Chilled's attacks no longer affect him at all. Bardock tanks his blast with minimal damage, catches his punches effortlessly, and completely overpowers him to the point where the battle stops looking competitive entirely. Bardock proceeds to then utterly dominate and defeat Chilled before the movie ends. In terms of scaling though, this version of Bardock is difficult to quantify precisely because we never receive concrete numbers. What we can say with confidence is that the 2011 Bardock should be significantly stronger than the original 1990 version. He survived near fatal injuries, received at least one of the major Zenkai boosts fully recovered, and trained for several days afterward. All that would naturally place him above his previous self even before transforming into a Super Saiyan. At the very least, Bardock undeniably became stronger, even if it wasn't specifically training with a concrete goal in mind. The problem is that the special never gives us an exact number for how much he improved, so most of the discussion comes down to speculation. Because of that, the fairest approach is to lowball Bardock as much as possible and work upward from there. To do that, we can use the smallest confirmed Zenkai boost multiplier shown in canon Dragon Ball, which comes from Vegeta during the Namek Saga. When Vegeta first arrives on Earth, his power level is 18,000, and after recovering from a battle against Goku, his power jumps to 24,000. This means that the increase was roughly a 1.333 multiplier. For simplicity's sake, we can just round that down to 1.3 times. Now, Bardock's power level before his recovery was stated to be approaching 10,000. To be generous but still reasonable, we'll simply place him at exactly 10,000. Applying that 1.3 multiplier would raise Bardock's base power to around 13,000 after his recovery and Zenkai boost. And honestly, this is the absolute lowest possible interpretation you can make for 2011 Bardock. Even with that low ball, we can still scale him using the fight against Chilled. We don't know Chilled's exact power level, but we do know that base Bardock was completely overwhelmed by him, while Super Saiyan Bardock proceeded to dominate him effortlessly. Assuming Chilled was roughly comparable to Frieza's first form at 530,000, that would place Super Saiyan Bardock around 650,000 in terms of power. Even if Chilled were somewhat weaker than Frieza, the overall point still remains the same. Super Saiyan Bardock would scale above first form Frieza regardless. So under this interpretation, yeah, the 2011 version of Super Saiyan Bardock would absolutely be capable of defeating first form Frieza. However, the moment Frieza transforms into his second form, if he's able to, the battle would change entirely. Second form Frieza exceeds 1 million in power, which would place him far beyond this low-balled version of Bardock. In that scenario, Bardock would still ultimately lose. But things get much more interesting if we decide to highball Bardock instead. Let's say the Zenkai boost Bardock received was closer to the massive one Goku obtained during the Namek Saga after recovering in the healing chamber. One where Goku's power jumped from 90,000 all the way to 3 million, which is about a 33.33 increase. If Bardock received a boost anywhere near that level, then his base power would skyrocket from 10,000 to roughly 333,000. Multiply that by the standard Super Saiyan multiplier 50, and Super Saiyan Bardock would reach approximately 16.65 million in power. At that level, Bardock would completely surpass every form of Frieza prior to his final form. Even Frieza's third form would be massively outclassed. The only version of Frieza that could still overpower him would be final form Frieza at higher percentages of his true power. For reference, Frieza at 50% sits around 60 million, which would still place him comfortably above this version of Bardock. But there's an important detail to consider here. Frieza almost never starts battles at full power. He slowly escalates throughout fights and intentionally suppresses himself to conserve stamina and toy with his opponents. That's exactly what happened during the Namek Saga against Goku. Frieza appeared comparable to base Goku, whose power level was around 3 million, but in reality, Frieza was only using a tiny fraction of his actual strength at the time. roughly 2.5 to 3% of his full power. The difference with Bardock though is mentality. Unlike Goku, Bardock wouldn't drag the fight out or allow Frieza to transform. If Bardock were overwhelming first form Frieza, he would likely go straight for the kill without hesitation. He wouldn't stand around waiting for Frieza to create distance, power up, or assess his later forms. So under a highballed interpretation, Super Saiyan Bardock could realistically defeat Frieza before the Tyrant ever reaches his strongest states. In that scenario, Bardock doesn't just win, but pretty decisively. Even under a heavy low ball, Super Saiyan Bardock should still be capable of defeating Frieza. But now it's time to move on to the most recent interpretation of the character, the canon Bardock from the Dragon Ball Super manga. Unlike the 1990 special or the 2011 version, this version of Bardock has far more concrete feats and direct scaling to work with. Through flashbacks in the Granola arc, we see Bardock confronting the Heaters, specifically Gas. At this point in the story, Gas still lacks proper control over his inner power. Whenever he taps into the deeper nature, he becomes unstable and berserk. Gas is completely determined to kill Granola, and Bardock, wanting to atone for some of the sins caused by the Saiyans, decides to protect him instead. The fight initially begins with both fighters in their base states, and Bardock is clearly outmatched early on. He can barely even damage Gas, let alone seriously hurt him. Despite this, Gas is still impressed enough by Bardock's abilities that he outright says he doesn't view him as a mere low-class Saiyan. That statement is important because Saiyan rankings actually carried weight in the old hierarchy. For comparison, Nappa was considered a mid-class Saiyan and actually had a power level around 4,000, while the only elite Saiyans were King Vegeta and Vegeta himself, with Vegeta sitting around 18,000 during the Saiyan saga. Based purely on that scale, Bardock's power could theoretically fall anywhere between 4,000 and 18,000. However, the situation becomes much more complicated once additional statements from interviews are taken into account. Totaro explained that the Heaters were elite level warriors within Frieza's organization and were significantly stronger than someone like Nappa. That alone removes the possibility of Bardock only being around the lower Saiyan tiers. Totaro also implied that the Heaters were above the level of the Ginyu Force and comparable to Abo and Kabo from the Yosun Goku and his friends Return Special. As the battle continues, Gas gradually unleashes more of his true strength and begins overwhelming Bardock completely. Bardock is essentially being dominated for a large portion of the fight, but eventually something changes. Bardock taps into what appears to be an awakened or instinctive state. His hair doesn't transform the way a Super Saiyans normally would, but he gains a glowing glowed aura that resembles Super Saiyan energy without exactly being in the form. The exact nature or multiplier of the state is never explained, but the increase in power is enormous. Bardock suddenly goes from struggling against his oppressed Gas to overpowering Gas in his unleashed state. He catches Gas's punches, lands blows powerful enough to leave him grasping for air, and casually blasts him across the battlefield. The difference becomes so massive that Bardock ultimately finishes the battle with the key attack, extremely similar to the final attack he used against Frieza in the original 1990 special. And with that, Bardock wins the fight. Now, scaling this version of Bardock becomes very interesting. At full power, Bardock defeats a Gas, a fighter implied to be stronger than members of the Ginyu Force and comparable to Abo and Kabo. Since Abo and Kabo were stated to rival Frieza, the most reasonable interpretation is that they were being compared to first form Frieza, whose power level was around 530,000. That would mean Bardock, while in his awakened state, should scale above that. And this becomes even more impressive when you remember how powerful the Ginyu Force already was. Guldo, the weakest member of them, still possessed a power level just below Krillin and Gohan on Namek, meaning he was likely around somewhere to 10 to 12,000 himself. Captain Ginyu, meanwhile, sat at 120,000. Yet the Heaters are portrayed as being above even that tier. The only real issue is whether Bardock permanently retained the power he used against Gas. The story never gives a direct answer. Logically though, it's difficult to imagine Bardock defeating someone comparable to first form Frieza, then later being able to unhandle Frieza's weakest transformation unless that awakened state was temporary. But if we assume Bardock could access that same level of power consistently, then first form Frieza should absolutely lose to him. Even under extreme lowball, the argument still works surprisingly well. Let's say base canon Bardock only is around Guldo's level at roughly 12,000. Multiplying that standard Super Saiyan boost of 50 would place Super Saiyan Bardock at around 600,000 in power. That would already surpass first form Frieza's 530,000, and that's using one of the lowest interpretations imaginable. If we instead scale Bardock on the level of strength he displayed against Gas, then Frieza's first form would likely be completely overwhelmed without much difficulty at all, even without Super Saiyan. So in the end, the results between the different versions of Bardock become pretty interesting. The 1990 movie Bardock would most likely still lose to first form Frieza even as a Super Saiyan, unless he ended the fight immediately before Frieza could power up. The 2011 version of Bardock, however, should be strong enough to defeat first form Frieza and potentially force Frieza into using later forms. And finally, the canon Dragon Ball Super manga version of Bardock at its absolute peak would outright dominate first form Frieza.